to Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Yeah, hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
You know, I like to start each episode by asking you guys if you've listened to anything interesting lately.
Yeah, I mean, it just came out sort of yesterday, but I've been digging into these OK Computer leaks that came out. It's 18 discs, 18 hours of crap to wade through. It's honestly pretty interesting. I thought it was, when I first read about it, I thought it was going to be like, remember that like cutting edge Bob Dylan box set where it was like every note. I thought it was going to be like that for OK Computer, but it's really just like a bunch of live stuff and then like, demos of songs and sometimes pieces of songs. It's really, it's actually cooler than I thought it was.
Is there like studio chatter and stuff like after the song or whatever?
Sometimes, not that much, but like when I was listening to today, they like fucked up or something and they were like laughing about it, But there's not tons of that.
What about you, Darren?
Well, I finally got around to checking out Vampire Weekend's The Father of the Bride album. Have either of you guys listened to it?
I listened to the first couple tracks and it just was not rubbing me in the right way. I don't know why.
Yeah, I tried it. I couldn't.
It's very different from like past Vampire Weekend. It seems a lot more like mellow and sparse,
rocky.
Like instrument wise. But I actually came to really love it. I don't entirely love like the album completely. Like the middle of the album kind of drags a little bit, but picks up right towards the end. And of course, I love like the first like 3 or 4 tracks a lot. But yeah, I mean, I've been really enjoying it.
I felt like really angry on the first track when, there's basically this amazing hymn, spiritual type of thing that's from the Thin Red Line soundtrack, the film. And so they're like, oh, that's a nice song. Let's just make a song that is the chords of that and then stop and just play that hymn, which is awesome. And I'm like, you can't fucking do that. Make your own song.
At least they didn't hide it,
Yeah, I guess not.
It's not exactly a sample. It's like...
it's just we're just going to play this song. Okay, anyway, in lieu of what I've been listening to lately, I wanted to report that I went to... I saw the Dark Star Orchestra and a whole lot of other jam bands at the Dark Star Jubilee in Legend Valley, Thornville, Ohio. That was, what was that, Memorial Day weekend, May 24th to 26th. It's a crazy thing. It's like a 3-day long festival where everybody kind of camps out and there's music playing the whole time. And then at night, each of those nights, this band, the Dark Star Orchestra, which is a Grateful Dead tribute band, plays. They basically like recreate in sort of like a note for note way some set from the history of the Grateful Dead.
Oh my god!
And they're really good. I mean, even their voices are so similar. It's like you shut your eyes and you really feel like you're watching the Grateful Dead. I think it's like the closest you can come to that experience. But it kind of got me thinking about what ended up being our topic this week. So while I was watching the band play the song they're named after, fittingly, Dark Star, which is widely considered one of the Grateful Dead's greatest and most experimental pieces, I started thinking about another one of my favorite cult experimental 60s bands, the Velvet Underground, and wondering why, at least in indie circles, the Velvet Underground is so celebrated while the Grateful Dead is pretty much ignored and sometimes even ridiculed. There's so many similarities and connections between these two bands, and yet they kind of feel like polar opposites. I kept thinking about the famous deleted scene from Pulp Fiction. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Mia Wallace says, "My theory is that when it comes to important subjects, there are only 2 ways a person can answer. Which way they choose tells you who that person is. For instance, there are only 2 kinds of people in the world, Beatles people and Elvis people. Now, Beatles people can like Elvis, and Elvis people can like the Beatles, but nobody likes them both equally. Somewhere you have to make a choice, and that choice tells you who you are." I thought this was very relevant for some reason to the Grateful Dead and the Velvet Underground. So to get to the bottom of this and to narrow the conversation a little, we decided to specifically compare and contrast the Grateful Dead's Dark Star with the Velvet Underground's own jammed out juggernaut, Sister Ray. We settled on a few live performances of each, which we'll get to a little later. But first, let's kind of address Mia Wallace's question. I'm assuming we'd all consider ourselves Velvet Underground people. So, Dan, what is your kind of personal history, current feelings about the VU?
I love the VU. Definitely a VU person over a dead person. My dog's name is Lou Reed. I have the banana tattooed on my arm, so a little bit of a fan.
Yeah, just a little fan. Yeah.
As for history, I think I got into them because Nirvana like covered "Here She Comes Now."
Oh, yeah.
I think that made me. I always was way back in the day, getting all these rare Nirvana things, and then I would Napster the whatever the original was, and so got me right in there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd call myself a pretty big fan of Velvet Underground. Maybe not a tattoo, on my body type of fan, but I've just absolutely adored them. I don't exactly know, I think, like where that history began, but probably similar to Dan, it was through another band, because so many bands basically, are very explicit about how much they love Velvet Underground, you know what I mean? And you just kind of fall into them, I think, in that sort of sense. But yeah, I mean, I completely adore them. And, Grateful Dead, like not at all. Not even a little.
All right. Well, we're going to dive a little deeper into that. I mean, for me, yeah, I'm definitely a great Velvet Underground person. I'm really like deeply obsessed. I think I've, just through my life, it was like I got the Velvet Underground and Nico album, was just utterly obsessed. Ended up getting White Light, White Heat. Thought there's no way this could be as good. I liked it even more. There are times in my life where the self-titled I like the most, Loaded I like the most. I listen to every live thing, no matter how bad quality it is or whatever. I have just completely obsessed over them for a very long time. As for the Grateful Dead, I'm pretty new to them, and I, would describe myself as kind of a recent convert. I think that actually last year, I talked about it on our old podcast, but I went for the first time to this Dark Star Jubilee, which is like an annual thing. And at that time, I just sort of got dragged along to it by a friend who's really into them and that whole kind of jam band scene. He promised me it'd be a good time. And in preparation, I was like kind of listening and trying to get to know them. I really had a negative opinion of them before, without really diving deep at all. I watched the Long Strange Trip documentary, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. And started to get really weirdly fascinated by them. And then ever since then, I mean, I've spent a whole year. I've listened to tons and tons of shows and really kind of learned what, maybe it'll change and evolve, but what, eras of Grateful Dead I really like. But Darren, you were about to say, I want to hear more, like actual distaste, repulsion for the Grateful Dead?
No. I it's not fair to say that because I really haven't like listened to them a lot, but I've just always shied away. I mean, I don't know why. I think it kind of has a little bit to do with what you mentioned about indie circles. You know what I mean? I'm not necessarily saying I'm like in an indie circle, but going through all my own history, I guess, of listening to different music and stuff. Like, of course, I heard of the Grateful Dead, but they always kind of seemed like a dad rock type of band, like just like no, I don't want to listen
like
to
the noodling and the
like it's like guitar noodling.
Everything.
Like, I mean, I love guitars, Dan knows, but I was always like, that's too much, that's going too far.
Yeah, what about you, Dan?
Too much guitar for Darren. I love it. Yeah, I kind of have like a love-hate relationship with the Grateful Dead. I got into them in like high school, and I liked them, and I still like them, but I'm like the only person that I think the studio stuff's a little better, especially the earlier. I like the earlier, sort of like roots country, kind of. They're like a better Birds to me. I always kind of like the jamming and the live shows. They could be pleasurable enough, like to put on in the background while you like work around the house or do some yard work or something. But actively listening to them is kind of annoying because, like Darren said, just too much noodling guitar. I think that's why I like the studio. It's it's got a confinedness to it. It can only be so long, and so I could do without the noodling, which is not a common position on the Dead.
Yeah, there's something weird because it's like maybe this is kind of what you're getting at, Darren, that it's like something about virtuosity, but it has no kind of hard edge to it. It's not like, Jimmy Page is going to shred your face off, which we all went through phases where we were really into. There's something like really just like, this. I still actually, no matter how much I like the Grateful Dead, cannot stand their sort of visual aesthetic, like with this like these bears that are rainbows and stuff. Like there's something so, that just like rubs me the wrong way. I'm like, I want to see like Jim Morrison with his fucking shirt off, and like Robert Plant's like, huge bulge, something awesome, like long hair, I don't know, like, you get what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, for sure. And like when you talk about like Jimmy Page versus like noodling, like, like there are songs, maybe it's like Stairway to Heaven or like Achilles' Last Stand, whatever. Like there are just like memorable guitar moments, that are crafted. But when you are just sort of like jamming, you just kind of get lost, and like there just doesn't seem to be any moment like that. And we'll get into that when we start talking about like Dark Star, like, you know what I'm saying? Like
I get what you mean, and also just the sheer like volume of output, like how many live Led Zeppelin records can you get? I think there's like 2 or 3, and like they're all pretty badass. But yeah, I mean, when there's like 1 million like dead shows you can choose from, just on Spotify, not even getting into like bootlegs or anything, it becomes like overwhelming and stuff. And then it's really hard to, as a novice, getting into it, it's hard to pick like, what which show should I even bother listening, especially when they're 3 hours long.
Exactly. When you see a track that's like 37 minutes,
exactly.
My God, what part of it's going to really like hook me into this,
wow, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think it was sort of dividing the Grateful Dead up into, they're kind of like a couple different bands throughout different periods.
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of like a psychedelic garage rock kind of thing. At one point, they move into that kind of folk Americana thing. You were talking about, Dan. They get into like a almost jazz fusion kind of vibe. They get into this like dancey disco dead, it's called, and you can kind of like pick your favorites and stuff. But so basically, what I wanted to establish here is that this is kind of the perspective we're coming from. I think I would consider myself converted. I'm somebody farther along than you guys, but I used to kind of share some of your negative opinions, like while I was on the outside looking in. So it's like, I started asking myself, like, is it bullshit? Why do people feel this way when the Velvet Underground is like the coolest thing ever? And I think there's really a lot of similarities there. And so, I thought we could together see if we can hash this out and see if it does make sense. So let's talk about some of those similarities. There's some kind of eerie coincidences, I would say. Like, both bands start out being called the Warlocks, and I found out they both changed sort of independently because there was a third band called the Warlocks that had already put an album out. Their debut albums come out 5 days apart in March 1967. Obviously, that ignites, like, they both have such cult followings. They're almost like the two greatest cult bands in, all of music history, I would say. Maybe, Dan, you can talk a little bit about, they both sort of, their forming moments are at these really fascinating, like, multimedia events. Can you talk about, like, Andy Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable?
Yeah. In fact, I went to the Warhol Museum like 2 years ago, and they have a room that is, like, supposed to be the Plastic Inevitable. And it was, like, Lou Reed's face, like, zooming in and out. It was these, like, weird multimedia, like, he would play, like, 3, 4, 5 different movies, like, on the screen at once, all, like, very disorienting, flashing lights and stuff. And then a band would play, and that band was the Velvet Underground, who were just making, like, a lot of racket. They weren't really playing, like, the songs we came to know on, Vu and Nico. In fact, the first Plastic Inevitable show was for some dentist convention. So, yeah. And they didn't know, what the fuck was going on. And a lot of people left. And that's basically the Velvet Underground's, like, first professional show ever.
So it's like it's like a multimedia thing, but like it's touring around, right? What are people doing? Are they like taking drugs and like hanging out? Is that the scene?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Or is it more of like an art museum thing, or what is it?
Yeah, it's like a art, I guess it was like bringing the New York club scene kind of to the masses or such.
Okay.
I don't really know where all it went, but I did tour around. I think it was just the East Coast, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Should have looked that up. But yeah, it was just this super, annoyingly arty thing almost.
Yeah. I mean, but just so fascinating that they're like the house band for this thing, and they're like, it's this experimental thing, and they're like, supposed to be providing the music, and they're almost like honing their, their skills and their vibe at this place. And then at the same exact time across the country, do you know as much about Ken Kesey's acid tests?
I don't know as much, but I do know about them, and it's sort of the same thing, like so weirdly. I mean, his is like the acid test is basically the hippie version of the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. They're touring around on a psychedelic colored bus, which is like really like, when a lot of people think of the 60s, you think of that like, colored bus, and that, that's what it's from, the acid test.
Tie-dye color, yeah.
Yeah, and then they would play these shows. The Dead was the house band. He would give everybody acid. And so
it was in in Punch. You paid $1 to get like a cup of Punch, and so everybody's tripping. And I think part of the point of it, right, was like to sort of spread awareness of this new amazing drug and this experience. Pry open the whole West Coast third eye.
There we go.
Getting back to last episode. Yeah, but they're like remarkably similar. This sort of unknown band at the time, touring around and playing for people who probably wouldn't have seen them otherwise,
Yeah, and they're honing their skills just like the Velvet Underground, and I think that's why they start to get into these like long jams, because they're playing all night long. And they also talk about, like, on that Long Strange Trip documentary, about how it was like a really freeing experience, because everybody's so fucked up that like sometimes they would just go up and like play a few notes and it just like wasn't happening, and they would just stop. And other times they would play until like 6 a.m. and they could just try stuff. And sometimes it would just descend into like pure noise and stuff like that. Were you aware of any of this, Darren? And isn't it kind of like fascinating how they're both coming up at the same time in such similar circumstances?
Yeah, I think I may have read a bit about the acid tests, maybe in like some sort of like 60s culture class in college, right? But yeah, I had no idea, absolutely no idea that the two of them were like basically doing this at the same time. Like, I never really associated like VU's history at all with like the Grateful Dead also being, contemporaries basically.
Yeah, and just like the fact that these, these like, so basically it's almost like both are starting as almost celebrations of drug culture, 60s drug counterculture, this kind of like subversive element that's growing in this late 60s moment. And just amazing that they like, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable and the acid tests are pretty short-lived little things, but their legacies sort of carry on all the way to today through these two just enormously influential cult bands. On top of that, I think musically, there are really a lot of similarities here in the sense that both bands are very experimental. And, we all know the Velvet Underground and how, John Cale is like, he's this guy who's kind of like studying all of this avant-garde, like European avant-garde art and stuff. And Lou Reed is, he's kind of like a street poet, but he's obviously into this kind of like, the same kind of like weird French, I don't know, existentialist shit that like Jim Morrison is into, this kind of like, it's pretty pushing the edges, pushing the boundaries of pop music kind of scene. At the same time, you've got the Grateful Dead, which is sort of interesting because they come from this mixture of sort of musicians that come from like the blues or folk, and then you've got kind of like the Eastern guy, one of the drummers. You've got Phil Lesh, the bass player, is actually like a trained and studied kind of avant-garde composer before he switches to playing bass with this band. And so they're both bringing these elements. I also was really fascinated to learn that, they're both kind of really taking a page out of the jazz. The free jazz thing is kind of exploding at this time. And I think these are two examples of that kind of spreading into, pop rock music. You know what I mean, Dan?
Yeah, I know they both like really admired Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor. And Jerry ended up like playing on a really late, I think it was in the 90s, like Cecil Taylor record and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think on the Long Strange Trip documentary, it's really fascinating. I'm actually fascinated. We'll talk more about it. But the rhythm guitarist, Bob Weir, he's like talking about how he got really into these jazz pianists like McCoy Tyner, for example, who plays on with Coltrane, like in the Love Supreme era, right? and how he's fascinated about the way the chords are arranged so that there's this space for Coltrane to kind of weave through. You know what I mean? Like you don't just play like a C major chord, and and that when you do that, Coltrane has to like solo on the top.
Mm-hmm.
But when you play like these kind of crazy sevenths and ninths and diminished blah blah blah, like there's space for him to weave inside of it. And so Bob Weir like kind of takes his rhythm guitar styles from that so that Jerry Garcia can solo and weave within it. And at the same time, you've got, the Velvet Underground really into this kind of like skronking, Coleman, Cecil Taylor, Albert Eiler shit. Darren, is any of this kind of, how do I say, surprising to you? I mean, when you think Grateful Dead, I assume you don't think like avant-garde that much.
No, I mean, definitely not. And, maybe it's just like this image of like an older Jerry Garcia that is just sort of like stuck in my head, you know what I mean? And I kind of revert back to the idea of like this sort of dad rock jam type of thing, not so experimental, you know what I mean? When it comes to like Velvet Underground, to me, it's like you're hearing people just like break all the rules and completely, disregard any of the, like the Beatles and what everybody else was doing in the 60s and stuff. Whereas to me, even the way you're kind of describing it, like Grateful Dead kind of still fits right into that, except they're just sort of bringing, a little bit of free jazz influence and stuff, but they're still like, it just seems like they're still like within the boundaries.
I think what you just said is like is what a lot of people think, and maybe like not such a great point. Like, the Velvet Underground, it's like they're breaking all the rules, which, yeah, of course. But then everybody sort of, or a lot of people feel like, the Grateful Dead is sort of within those boundaries. But really, when you think about it, like they're breaking a shit ton of rules too. I don't know if it's just like it's become cliche and you forget that they made the cliche, kind of thing. Like
maybe,
or what. But like not a lot of bands were doing 30-minute jams or jams at all or any of the crap they were up to. Like it's like the experimentalness of the Dead and boundary pushing is sort of like lost for some reason.
Yeah, I want to return to this, but I think one of the major problems is that the Grateful Dead didn't break up like so fast the way that the Velvet Underground did. The Grateful Dead toured literally until death, until Jerry Garcia died.
Still, they're kind of touring with John Mayer now.
John Mayer, yeah. So, and we'll talk more about this, but it's like, if you think about it, it's like such a huge chunk of their career is now that, and it's almost like they reach somehow. I mean, it's almost fascinating. You got to watch this documentary, Darren, Long Strange Trip. I really cannot recommend it enough. But their height of popularity is like late 80s, early 90s. They somehow have just been sort of chugging along, playing completely by their own rules. I think a genuinely progressive sort of experimental band. And then they kind of like settle into this kind of middle age, I don't want to denigrate it too much before a bunch of deadheads email us. I'll just say that it's the later stuff I'm still learning. I know there's probably a lot to discover in that period, but it's not something I've been able to get so into yet. But they settle sort of into a familiarity, kind of like almost a nostalgia thing. And that's what we think of. I mean, even now.
I mean, I think what you're describing is exactly what I kind of like remember seeing like through the 90s, anything regarding like Grateful Dead. It's like these old guys and like only older people were listening to them because they're like reminiscing about the 60s and 70s, you know what I mean? Like, but with their like old tie-dye shirts on still from the 60s.
I know. Yeah, something like gets kind of like outdated about it. And I even to this day, I keep like when I think of Jerry Garcia in my mind, I see him old for some reason.
Yeah, me too.
I remember actually, I'm trying to retrain myself because I remember when I was young and I discovered the Doors. For some reason, my first image of him was when he was like kind of fat with a beard and stuff. And I had to train myself to see like the cool, badass, shirtless, Jim Morrison from, 1966 or whatever. And it made the music a lot better, I'll be honest. So So now we're kind of like.
Can I say something? Do you guys remember those like old infomercials for like music collections that would show up on like VH1 or whatever, and they talk about like a box set or something?
Yeah.
I swear there was like a Grateful Dead one that would like always be playing some sort of like
maybe
I'm sure
collection of these great concerts or whatever.
Yeah.
It's weird to think like why is the old image like burned into our brains, you know? But it sounds like we're kind of gravitating into the differences now. Okay, so I think there are a lot of similarities, and like we were kind of talking about, I really do think both were genuinely experimental bands, and so maybe one big difference is that one went on, kind of past their prime, and the other one never got a chance to, which is something we'll return to as well. But there are also a lot of like really fascinating differences, I think. So despite they actually shared the stage on a few occasions, these bands in the late 60s, but the Velvet Underground really seemed to hate the Grateful Dead and actually the entire San Francisco scene that the Grateful Dead comes from. Here's some choice quotes from Lou Reed. It's just tedious, a lie, and untalented. They can't play, and they certainly can't write. The Airplane, the Dead, all of them. They're amateur, they can't play. Jerry's not a good guitar player. It's a joke, and the Airplane is even worse, if that's possible. All those people are the most untalented bores that have ever lived. So why do you think, despite all these kind of similarities of where they're coming from, like why did he and why do a lot of current Velvet Underground fans feel this way?
I guess it's like the hippie thing, like you got to think like Velvet Underground was from New York City when New York was like very scary and seedy and had drug use was heroin and like not fun drugs, and then the Dead, the hippies are all happy go lucky, LSD, it's like a colorful, even just if you close your eyes and like think of the Grateful Dead, or you think of like tie-dye colors, everything's like bright, shimmery. Velvet Underground, I in my mind I see them in black and white, it's dark, sunglasses,
grainy, hard
like
to see.
Yeah, like basically the polar opposite of the hippie scene. And I mean, it's really like strange to even know that they're going on at the same time,
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I could totally imagine somebody like Lou Reed at the time, or like fans at the time, kind of looking at that scene and thinking like how inauthentic these people are. You know what I mean? Like they're just high, like Velvet Underground, they're not singing about flowers in your hair and all that kind of stuff.
No, exactly.
Like,
and Lou also was like a huge dick and would say dick things about basically any band that anyone asked him about too. So, take it with a grain of salt a little bit.
I think I had sort of an epiphany as we were preparing for this show, and I want to get your take on this, but I sort of realized that it's almost like in the 60s, there are two strands of sort of 60s culture, or even in the sense of experimental art. And it really neatly sort of divides between like an East Coast, West Coast thing. Like the West Coast is kind of an optimism about this culture, like a serious utopian kind of optimism. And the idea that like LSD or any kind of drugs are sort of like the key to harmony and people getting along and progress and stuff like that. Whereas on the East Coast, you've got more of this kind of like, it's not about acid. It's more like all the shit that the Velvet Underground sings about, like speed and, heroin. It's dark, it's depressing, it's shitty. It's like there's this real kind of nihilism to it. And if you even think about, I wish I could see that exhibit, like this exploding plastic inevitable thing. But, I got to imagine it's not about how bright the future is. It's more about like this kind of self-aware intelligentsia kind of thing, like deconstructing art. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, if anything, it's like, dystopian. It's so like when you walk into like the exhibit, there's 3 or 4 screens. I can't, it's been a couple years, but you're like basically surrounded by like videos, and they're not like, a normal movie or something. It's like one of them is literally somebody like Lou Reed standing against the wall, and then somebody taking a camera like very close to his face and just zooming in and out as quick as they can. It's like, and it's
scary.
Yeah, it's like scary, and it's bright and not bright like the way the Grateful Dead, like bright in actual like light. and just like disorienting and like if you were like those dentists or somebody who didn't know what was going on, like probably pretty scary.
Yeah, you kind of know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, like, you know, what I was trying to like formulate while you were like speaking, you know, to me, it's like this East Coast is obviously less optimistic. It's more, they're like trying to reveal the layers or like peel back the layers and take like a really close look at reality that like, yeah, this is the true human nature. You know, people are drug dealers. They're shady. They want to take advantage of people. They're like, you know, that dark alleyway in New York that you see that you shouldn't walk down, like, or this really shady nightclub owner that's like clearly like a smack dealer doing other things. Like they're, you know, like, and it's like coming to grips with like, this is the reality. You know what I mean? Like this is real life, not what these guys are doing with their, you know, taking LSD and trying to like, you know, blind themselves to the real, you know, this is
the
like
material world.
Yeah. It's hard for me to articulate it, but like you can just, it's like a stark contrast between the two. Yeah.
It's like polar opposites. And, you know, I was like having epiphany after epiphany because it's really fascinating. Like if you think about something like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, right? What's that guy that was hanging out with them? You know, he's like
Neil Cassidy.
Dean Moriarty. Neil Cassidy, yeah, the real guy. You know, he's actually part of the Merry Pranksters, like the bus that Ken Kesey is driving around, and he's hanging out with the Grateful Dead and stuff. But On the Road is like this formative text somehow for both of these movements. And yet, you know, a lot of people read On the Road and they see it as like this guy just searching for like transcendence or something. And yet you can also read it. I don't know how much time you guys have spent with this book or if it's been a long time since you read it, but you can also read it and it can be kind of depressing. Like this like Dean Moriarty guy is just like, or Neil Cassidy is leaving a bunch of fucking chaos everywhere he goes. Like he's just chasing this dream and like fucking people over everywhere and everything's sad and shitty at the end. And it's almost like, you know, when I read it, I was like, am I reading the same book as everybody else? Because I thought this was supposed to be like some really kind of like cool hippie thing, you know? And it's almost like you can take the same thing and read it two different ways. And that's literally what is happening on the East and West Coast at this time. I think about other stuff like experimental music at this time. You know, you think about like, you know, it's like these bands have such similar influences. Something like, you know, you talked about Cecil Taylor, John Coltrane, you know, Ornette Coleman, Albert Eiler, Tony Conrad. I wrote some of these down. Lamont Young. Okay, take Lamont Young and just be like, remember how we were talking about like there's this, we talked about him on our old podcast, and there's this kind of Eastern spirituality to him and to a lot of these avant-garde people. Like, God, who am I thinking of? Oh, Terry Riley, right? Like this mysticism. And yet also Lamont Young is kind of breaking music down into like what it really is, which is just random, you know, like the random matter of the universe collided and made people who for some reason make music, and one day this whole earth will be swallowed up and disappear one day. You know what I mean? Like, am I going on too far?
No, I get you. You know,
you can get whatever you want from these influences, and it's amazing that both bands are like taking it in such different directions.
Yeah, I mean, really, yeah. Lamont Young is a great example of that because, yeah, he does have like tons of that like spiritual stuff. Like I went to his Dream House exhibit thing in New York, and the whole thing is about like, or at the time it switches, but when I went, it was like these tones that were based on some Eastern religion that I don't know anything about, you know, and they moved in regards to that and the sun and all this, which is kind of like hippie bullshit, you know, if you look at it that way. But then if you just listen to the music, it is like, it's more of a Velvet Underground thing, you know, these big drones, like John Cale's viola. It was that kind of stuff, you know. It's so really, yeah, it's which part of it do you want to accept or read into or take, you know?
Yeah, are you kind of buying this, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, it all kind of goes back to what we were, you know, talking about in what you mentioned, like the different ways of reading, literally the same story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's totally shocking. I'm kind of like dumbfounded, like just having this discussion because I came to this not really knowing a lot about the Grateful Dead, and you know, it makes a lot more sense thinking in terms of like, you know, it's an interpretation of what's going on at the same time. You know what I mean? It's not two different eras, not two different time periods. It's the same time period, and one has a totally different take on it.
Yeah.
Not just them, obviously a lot of others, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's kind of amazing. If you're thinking about like, am I a Grateful Dead person or am I a Velvet Underground person? You could probably get the answer. Like, do you feel inspired or do you feel depressed when you finish On the Road? You know?
Exactly.
You know, stuff like, you know, I also thought about there's almost these two strands of like experimental jazz, which we'll talk about as we get into these pieces in a second, but huge influence there. But some jazz, you know, I wonder if you agree with me, Dan, like some of this free jazz is about transcendence. Like in the same way, John Coltrane is quite spiritual, you know, or there's like this spiritual element about chasing something, chasing transcendence, something higher, you know. On the other side, you have people like Cecil Taylor, who are destruction, you know, free jazz as destroying all the boundaries of what music can be. You know, he's literally smashing the piano. You know, it's almost like the difference between Andy Warhol and Ken Kesey that we were talking about earlier, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with the free jazz stuff, yeah, exactly the same way. I mean, Pharoah Sanders, Alice Coltrane, you know, all that stuff's like heavy with the Eastern, you know, religions and all that stuff. But again, you can read it the other way and read about the, you know, the deconstruction of music and the freewheelingness of it all. And again, you know, on what you like about it, I think says which one of these people you are, a Dead or a VU.
Yeah. But does it feel like, I mean, can you do that with the Grateful Dead as well? Or doesn't it feel like it's like too late or too many steps down at that point? Like you can't read the Grateful Dead and feel nihilistic.
I don't think you can because, I mean, one, it's just like such an ingrained part of the culture that they're the opposite, you know, of the nihilism and everything. But also just things, and maybe it is the culture, but things about them just are incongruent with that. The bright colors, the dancing bear logos, the you know the happy drugs and stuff. You know, it just like sort of is the antithesis of like what we think of when we think of those different subsets of people and cultures.
Do you think, like, Gabe, since you're like now sort of converted, as you mentioned, like are they sort of similar to the Velvet Underground, where like I think it was one of those articles you posted, Dan, about like describing it like you can't just like a little bit of the Velvet Underground or like a couple songs, you know. Same with like the Coltranes, I would imagine. Like you can't just like sort of dabble. Like either you like are really into it or you're just like, this is not for me. Like, is the Grateful Dead like this too?
I mean, I think definitely, but I don't know, because there's something, I mean, we'll get into this, but for me, it was like, honestly, kind of recognizing the similarity between the Velvet Underground and the Grateful Dead that kind of got me into them, because I realized that the early stuff, like from the 60s, when they're like really this kind of psychedelic garage rock band, I was like, this is amazing. I mean, I love shit like this. I love, you know, like 13th Floor Elevators. Shout out to Rocky Erickson, who passed away just a couple days ago, by the way. This kind of like psychedelic garage rock, all the stuff that's on those Nuggets compilations and stuff. And like, I was like, this fits right on here. Why are they rejected? And then it was like, you know, and then you sort of move into these other periods and it's like sort of confusing, you know, it doesn't sound the same anymore. And you're kind of, you know, I'm struggling to get into like the jazz fusion kind of vibe. And, you know, maybe you kind of find the strands of the stuff you like and hear it kind of getting there. But it's like, you know, so a long way to answer your question. I think honestly, for me, it was best to think of the Grateful Dead as like 5 different bands. And yet when you get into one of those versions, you start to kind of get obsessed in a weird way where you want to like keep chasing and finding more. You know, can you kind of relate to this with some other group, Dan?
I can't think of another example off the top of my head like that, but you know, the Grateful Dead, I sort of said at the top, like I sort of am just a kind of fan, you know, like you kind of have like your Dead. Like I like you said, I like the 60s psychedelic, like Anthem of the Sun's like a great record, and Oxa Mox or whatever that one with the weird like dick skeleton on the front. And then I really love the sort of folky Americana couple records. But yeah, like I'm not like I'm not hardcore into it. I'll listen to a live show here and there, when I'm just around the house. But if somebody asked me what my favorite show is ever, I don't really know. I honestly usually just pick ones that are like from the state I live in or like venues I've been to, just because it's like kind of cool. But
yeah. Well, okay, so I think we can continue touching on this, but we should dive into the specifics. Maybe hashing out some of these huge philosophical aesthetic topics that we're getting at will be a little bit easier when we get into actually Dark Star versus Sister Ray. So I kind of gave you guys 3 incarnations of both tracks. We'll start with Dark Star, and I wanted to give you guys a sense of how this, very improvisatory piece, obviously, sort of how it worked and how it evolved over this sort of early period that we're talking about. So first, we got a shorter performance at the Carousel in San Francisco on February 14th, 1968. A longer one at the Fillmore West, also in San Francisco, in 1969. This is from the famous Live/Dead album. And another very famous, these are actually all very famous performances, but this one's very long, from August 27th, 1972 at Ken Kesey's Dairy Farm in Veneta, Oregon, or it might just be a benefit for his farm at a nearby location. I couldn't figure out a straight answer, but let's try to describe what this song sounds like. Maybe taking each one separately, or maybe just kind of as a whole. What is Dark Star?
I mean, as a whole, it's like the most jammy jam band thing you could possibly do. It seems like there's only like a handful of lyrics that just sort of like, it really seems like that's not the important, like a lot of bands like live or something, when they are jamming a little bit and then they finally, kick into the lyrics, the crowd goes wild because they like finally realize what song it is. The Dark Star doesn't seem to be like that. If anything, it's like the lyrics are like the turn off of the song. But yeah, it's just, it is the like quintessential, like if you think of a jam band, this is sort of what you think of. And maybe not the first performance that you put on here, the 68 one, but definitely the 69, and I think especially the 72. The 68 one is like
it's shorter.
Yeah, it's much shorter. It's pretty close to like what the studio version sounds like. I popped that on too. Just to check.
Yeah, and I want to kind of like give a sense of maybe this is closer. It's like fuzzier and more garage rockish to like what it might have sounded like at the acid test,
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'll go ahead and say that was probably my favorite one.
Okay.
Of them.
Okay.
What do you want to add, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of describe the song as having, like you said, it has a section or like a little bit of structure that's built around these lyrics, right? And like, it comes together really well in this 6-minute version because you don't wander off and completely lose yourself in whatever, is happening, because that, the Dark Star lyrics and all of that are there. The song kind of stays contained, right? And then, you have to forgive me because I've listened to these things so many damn times. Like when you get to these longer ones, I feel like it repeats, like it does the lyric section at least twice, maybe, right? Like kind of towards the end. I don't know. Maybe I'm totally off on that.
So actually, the 1969 one does the lyric section. I guess we should, probably anybody listening to this knows, but it's almost like a little poem, like a sort of 3-4 stanza poem. This is the lyrics section, and there's kind of like a bouncy, something like an interesting kind of bouncy riff. It's almost like circular, hypnotic.
It builds up to that.
Yeah, and you've got this kind of like, so you've got this like organ line that's like like descending, and and you've got like the hand percussion specifically in these early ones, and it's just like kind of this weird kind of almost slowed down circus or something kind of jam. And then there's like this poem. And, so the first one we looked at is, like you said, short, and it's almost like just the song with a little bit of soloing over that kind of like riff. By the time we get to 1969, it does that. Although actually it takes like, something like 7 or 8 minutes to kind of form,
Right.
which I think is really fascinating because it's almost like, a quote. This is a very Grateful Dead quote, I think, is that the Dark Star is always playing somewhere in the universe, and they just sort of tap into it, right. So that tells you everything you need to know about their philosophy. But I kind of like how it sort of imitates that, because it's like in this performance, it's just sort of random nothing, is happening.
I did,
and it sort of comes together.
I liked that about the 69. I like noticed that, it feels like it takes them a minute to get it built up. It like really reminded me of like My Bloody Valentine, like Holocaust thing. You know how like the whole it's famous that it like takes like kind of forever to get like built up, and then you're just building and building this wall of sound, and then finally it like you get it. And Dark Star and sort of that performance of the ones we listened to in general, like gave me that feeling, which was like kind of cool. I feel like it would be a little better if I was there. It's like when you're sitting at home or at work and that's happening.
Perhaps tripping also would help, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe. You're sitting at work, you're just like, all right, are they fucking tuning their instruments or what? Let's get it going.
Well, so I mean, I like the long kind of build up, and Gabe, even though it's a little silly the way it's described, but like, it almost seems like they have no real, plan as to like, okay, here's when we're going to do this 48 times, and then, the lyrics are going to start. Right. It doesn't feel that way at all. It just kind of feels like they're just feeling it out.
It's like natural.
Yeah, we've all played music live. We've kind of jammed out and just like felt when it felt right to move on and stuff, and it really feels natural. It's really what comes after that section that I kind of really get lost in.
Yeah, so to return to your question, on the 69, it basically completely falls apart. We build up very slowly to like this verse tone, this poem part kind of thing, and then it just sort of like descends into random chaos. And this is like we were kind of saying, it's like this is almost like their loosest composition. And I think it's weird when you know about the Grateful Dead and then you come to them and you find out that they actually write incredibly tight pop songs. It's like it's not all Dark Star, but Dark Star is so loose. It's clearly meant to just go off in whatever direction. It's almost like just this short poem. We'll do that. We'll build to that, do it, and then go wherever the hell we want. But the 1969 one actually returns in the end, somehow, despite going into like complete random chaos. To the verse part, the poem.
Okay, I was
part.
right.
The 1972 one never comes back. It just like goes. And there's something like thematically interesting about this approach, because again, if you take that like quote and the subject matter and everything, it's like the song forms out of nothing, and it becomes something. Which I actually really, I get the like song part stuck in my head a lot. And then it's thematically appropriate for it to just sort of fall apart into, just random matter. I mean, this is a song about a black hole, We should have done this episode a couple of months ago when everybody was like into black holes, and
that picture, yeah.
But I think this is so indicative of like what the Grateful Dead is all about, and like how the Velvet Underground is so different in the sense that they're writing a song about a black hole, and a black hole, to me is kind of a horrifying thought, because it's like the end of the universe or something. It just like scrambles meaning and logic and everything, like who knows what's in there. It's like this kind of nihilist presence, that makes it impossible for me to believe in God or something. For the Grateful Dead, it's like a pathway to another, to enlightenment or something, like to another way of being. They're like describing this like Dark Star crashes, pouring its light into ashes, reason tatters, the forces tear loose from the axis, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, shall we go, you and I, while we can, through the transitive nightfall of diamonds, whatever that means. But it's an evocative image. But you know what I mean? It's like the song sort of falls apart because that's like what's happening to their perception, or there's something like it makes sense to me.
Like by the time you get to the lyrics, it's like there they are at the black hole or whatever, and then the next sequence that follows is kind of like that trip through to this other side or whatever.
Like what would happen like when your body disintegrates
Right.
as you pass through a black hole or something. It's almost like trying to do that, and it's such a lofty theme. Or the Velvet Underground would never write about something like this, but I think the Velvet Underground would be more like me, where if they looked at a black hole, they would be like, fuck, nothing matters and nothing means anything. You know,
Exactly.
like, let's burn this motherfucker down. You know, the Grateful Dead is, you know what I'm saying, Dan?
Yeah, no, I get that, and you know, that's funny that you can even sort of read, especially the first like little half of those lyrics, like nihilistically, you know, if you want to, the whole whatever transcendental diamonds, a little hard to read that way, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I mean, that is like a cool kind of like conceptually, it is like sort of a cool piece. And I think the 69 version sort of does it best. Like I liked how it did come back, you know, like it's sort of impressive to like have a song, you know, build from nothing, it plays, and then you like sort of lose it and you're like, oh, they fucking off track now, and then oh shit, you know, and it's sort of like it's not even just like, oh, now we're back, you know, it's sort of like it's almost like gradually rebuilding and everything, and sort of surprises you, and you know, it's impressive. The 72, like when it just gets lost and it never comes back, and it, you know, I like, honestly, the first time I listened to it, it sort of just, you know, we had put it in like these playlists, you know, it sort of just ends, and I thought like, oh, is this like split into 2 tracks? Like, did you fuck up? And I like looked it up, you know, and everything, and because it just sort of seemed like, you know, they lost it. But I guess that's interesting too, because, you know, maybe some nights they lose it, some nights they don't, you know, sometimes it comes back, you know, that is sort of like an interesting experience.
Yeah, sometimes they use it like to sort of move into a different piece entirely, which is what happened sort of at that Veneta performance, and sometimes they like go into other songs and stuff, and then like find their way back to the conclusion of Dark Star, you know, like an hour later. And, you know, so Darren, does this kind of strike you as something that's like, you know, we talked about the Olivia Tremor Control and the sort of like experimental stuff that they do, sometimes being more interesting to think about than to listen to. Is that kind of where you were?
Yeah, definitely. You know, because when I'm listening, I'm not imagining any of this stuff. I'm just kind of imagining a handful of guys on this like festival stage, kind of just, you know, feeding off of each other and just playing heads down, you know, just jamming out. And, you know, it's interesting, but it's hard to, you know, think real philosophically about, you know, the other stuff that we're discussing. You know, again, I'm not trying to make a joke here when I'm like, perhaps if I were tripping, things would be different. But honestly, like, I mean, what was the point of those people tripping on acid and then listening to this stuff? Well, it gave them like 30 minutes to, you know, let their mind go wherever the hell it was going, and then have a nice soundtrack along with it. You know what I mean? It's hard to, you know, I'm struggling like imagining like what that experience is like versus what my experience is like versus what we are actually just discussing, you know, about the more lofty theme of the song.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about, something about this culture, about like, you know, this path to transcendence and stuff, and this like real optimism, this real belief that music could do that, you know, and that's kind of like the thing they're trying to do. I mean, I guess that tripping would be interesting or help or something, but it's almost like they're trying to make music that would do that with or without acid, you know?
Well, I mean, like the idea is it's like escapism, basically, right?
Yeah.
And then like the Velvet Underground, by contrast, is not necessarily trying to escape. It's actually like facing it, like, you know, facing down whatever it is that the Grateful Dead is trying to escape from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, why don't we jump into it? We can like kind of come back and bounce back and forth. But for Sister Ray, you know, I gave you guys 3 pieces as well. We got the original studio version from 1968's White Light, White Heat, which is basically a live jam anyway. A 1969 performance at the Family Dog in San Francisco, of all places, which they hated, I guess. This is from the Quine Tapes officially released bootleg from 2001 or something like that. And another 1969 performance at the Matrix, also in San Francisco, from the recently released complete Matrix tapes. And this one certainly wins the longest jam competition here, clocks in at nearly 37 minutes. So how would you describe what Sister Ray is and what they're trying to achieve with this piece?
Well, first off, if you ask someone to guess which band would have the longest song, in this playlist, you would not guess the Velvet Underground, I don't think.
No,
which is really funny. But for Sister Ray, the 68 and the 69, it's very very abrasive. It's just like from the get-go, kind of in your face, very repetitive. It's kind of just the same chords over and over. The drums like really rarely change. And then these like weird lyrics about shooting up and messing up the carpet and sucking on ding dongs.
Right.
It's really like a wild thing. Like the White Light, White Heat version, in case people don't know, the reason it's not weird to include that one is it like literally was one take. It's completely live, so much so that the engineer refused to stay in the room. He pressed play and left and said, get me when you're done. Not listening to this noise. So it fits in there. And it basically is that. I mean, I think to somebody that's not hip to it or something, as the Dead would maybe say, it like is very noisy, very like distorted, abrasive, in your face, kind of the opposite of what's happening with Darkstar.
Yeah, I mean, I would also want to mention that I feel like the White Light, White Heat version is actually very different than these two other live takes, to the point where I almost found them disappointing, just because it's just so different. Like, it's almost unrecognizable outside of Lou Reed's lyrics. You know what I mean? Like, if it was less lyrics, right, and just a lot more jamming, like the Grateful Dead, I would hardly say that they're the same song, right? The White Light, White Heat one is, at least starting out, like you mentioned, Dan, kind of like the same kind of chord progression. The drums, there's a very clear beat. There's the Velvet Underground style lyrics and singing from Lou Reed, and then it kind of descends into chaos. But and I guess we'll get into it. But that version just doesn't seem to meander into just noodling territory. Whereas as soon as the 69 one starts, it's not abrasive in terms of just jumping right in with the crunch.
Yeah.
Especially because, in fact, it doesn't become Sister Ray until you hear Doc and Sally inside. Okay, we're listening to Sister Ray now. I got you.
Yeah, especially with Lou's little explaining of the story or whatever, at the beginning, which is really cool.
Yeah. So if you think about this, it's basically the first one is just a pure rush. It's everything is as distorted as possible. It's just a punishing sort of wall of noise. The organ is run through distortion, which John Cale's playing.
So perfect.
Of course, he leaves the band by the time of these 1969 performances we're listening to. But
but there's an organ player in those.
Yeah, but
too.
it's I couldn't quite figure out who's playing what. In fact, there are points where I swear to God, 5 people are playing something.
Because it sounds like there's a bass guitar too.
There's bass. There's 2 guitars for sure. There's drums. And there's an organ. I don't know how they're doing this, and I couldn't find any information. It was actually driving me fucking crazy. But anyway, John Cale is not in the band. And in the studio one, there's no bass. And it's just the organ. It's distorted as shit. And it's so distorted. It's so loud that it sometimes becomes a drone track. It's pure drone. And you can tell even at points that the band cannot fucking hear what is going on because they go out of time,
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of it's kind of the thing, and it's there's another interesting similarity, right? Which is that in the Grateful Dead documentary, Bob Weir kind of talks about we realized at one point they had this epiphany. Of course, they're on acid at this time. It's right after one of these acid tests, but they don't want to make some lame ass monument that's supposed to live forever and like keep their, you know, dead memory alive. You know, they want to like live in the quote exploding moment. Okay. So that's why they're like, let's make, you know, live playing, like real time stuff our thing. And it's interesting that there's like this similar impulse with the Velvet Underground here, which is like, we're going to do this one take, we're going to leave in mistakes, you know, and it's going to be this exploding moment that we're going to capture, you know, the same kind of thing. And it's interesting that this piece gets jammed and reinterpreted, I mean, to huge lengths in almost like a similar, you know, ambition as the Grateful Dead. Because, you know, if you think about something like, I always think of Sister Ray as being similar to John Coltrane's Chasing the Train, which is like the you know, when the birth of his like fully formed self in a way. It's like this thing he would do live where it's a pretty simple song and he just like rips through the chords and rips through, you know, like lines and notes and stuff for like 18 minutes straight. And he's like, you know, chasing something, as the title tells you. You know, he's like trying to push it as far as he can and get somewhere. And it's like, I feel that same impulse driving both of these pieces, no matter how actually different they sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Are you on board with that, Darren?
I don't know. I feel like the two live Sister Rays are, I don't know. You know, with Dark Star, I feel like it's a bit easier to follow that train of thought because, you know, the song has enough structure and it's recognizable for the most part. Once they get like way out of there, it's hard to recognize. But like each one of the Dark Stars that we have on this list, I felt like I recognized up until you get to like the lyric section. You know what I mean? Like the centralized idea was there, and I feel like Sister Ray, the White Light, White Heat has all of that, but the other live ones just feel real jammy and just kind of like. I
can't believe you don't like them. I think they blew my mind when I first heard them.
I feel like the White Light, White Heat version is like a masterpiece. Like it's almost unfair that it's on this list because I
actually strongly prefer the live ones at this point in my life. Like I maybe we can interrogate that a little bit more. But to stick with the studio for a second, I mean, it's also interesting, right? That if we were talking about like the Grateful Dead is almost capturing an acid trip or something with Dark Star. I mean, this studio Sister Ray is like what it's like to take amphetamines, you know, which is he's like shouting at the end of the song, you know, to be on speed, because it's like the drums, you know, it is kind of like a continuous propulsive thing, but they like speed up or they go like double time and sometimes get going like really fast. And it kind of like creates, even though it sort of like stays basically the same, like, you know, basic tempo in a way. It creates this impression of like the song is speeding up continuously over the entire like 17 minutes, you know, even when everything falls apart and it's like just the snare going, you know, and like even it sounds like the organ is like sputtering out like he blew the amp or something like that. It just feels like it's getting faster and faster and faster the whole time, which is, you know, obviously like the complete opposite direction that the Grateful Dead go, and sort of like breaking it apart to where it's like almost not even a song hanging together anymore. But I also am sort of fascinated by, I don't think the Grateful Dead get enough credit for like their sort of experimental tendencies. If you think about it in the late 60s, you know, the way that obviously the Velvet Underground are using their instruments, it's like the guitar soloing on the studio version is like basically like a Ornette Coleman or Cecil Taylor kind of destruction of the sound of the instrument. The feedback is as important as the notes he's playing, if not more so. You know what I mean? Right. And the Grateful Dead do that kind of stuff too. Like in that 1969 Dark Star, you know, there's that sort of like feedbacky section where I don't know how he's doing it, but somehow like Jerry starts sort of like hitting these solo notes, and it's like feedbacking in a crazy way each time he hits it. There's stuff where you can hear like a very Sonic Youth kind of vibe I get, where you can hear that they're like Bob Weir is like hitting the bridge of his guitar, so it like kind of, you know, like gong, like a gong or a chime or something. There's like scraping on the strings and stuff. You know what I'm saying, Dan? Like expanding what an instrument can do.
Yeah, like not using it in its intended way, which a lot of those 60s experimental acts like did, Bronca and all that stuff, which later, but same thing.
Yeah, and like a John Cage kind of a vibe. Like they're both coming from this tradition, and it's interesting that even by 1972, I think you can hear that they're doing a little less of that. The Grateful Dead like kind of gets a little bit tighter. It's also interesting that 72 Dark Star, the drums are playing instead of just hand percussion. There's one drummer at that point, and he's like giving a pulse to the entire thing, even though it gets like, it almost becomes pure like jazz especially like when just the bass and it's piano now instead of organ. And yet it does get quite noisy at the end. I just, sticking with the studio, you wouldn't grant that, Darren, that there's something like sort of inherently similar in the idea behind these two pieces?
Yeah, I still kind of feel like Jerry Garcia, guitar-wise, is like still playing like, melodic.
Yeah, very musically.
Scales. Like it just, compared to like a Lou Reed, where it reminds me sort of like, Stephen Malkmus's like, guitar solo from Pavement, where it's like pure it's not meant to sound wonderful, you know what I mean? And it's he's not trying to sound like a Jimmy Page sort of thing or like a crazy guitarist, but it still sounds amazing. And I feel like that's all over Sister Ray, but like,
I mean, I do appreciate that. Like, I think that Jerry Garcia is not like virtuosity. He's not like, whoever, like Steve Vai or something. It's like, very melodic. It's like actually like something supposed to contribute to the music, but it is very musical. You're right. How do you feel, Dan, about these later live versions of Sister Ray, which do get a lot more musical? You can hear that they're very much in the self-titled and loaded period, which is where these performances come from. And it's really quite like chill, mellow vibes sometimes. It still kind of does that, like, let's speed it up during different portions, but then they bring it way back down, and there's like the two guitars are kind of like soloing in a very melodic, like almost bluesy way, like, isn't that, I mean, it changes a lot from its original intention.
Yeah, especially the last one, though, the Matrix tapes one. That one, it's like a almost completely different song. I was listening to it in the car, and my wife asked if it was an acoustic version, because at the get-go, it almost sort of sounds like that. And while it does get like, it has that big jam section in the middle, and it does do the speed up thing, and the drums get a little nuts, but like it never gets like half as nuts as the studio White Light White Heat version.
Also, shout out to the part where like one of the characters shoots the other one, and he like says something like, it sounds like this, and then like plays like the most screeching guitar chord like possible. Really fucking cool. But do you like it, Dan? How this piece evolves?
Yeah, I do. I've gotten in points in my life where I've gotten really obsessed with live Sister Rays. I think I've heard every one that's ever been recorded.
I wish there were more.
Yeah, there's not that many. But yeah, I like it. I don't know if it's like I like it because I've heard the studio so many times, and it's like, it's one of my favorite, like it's probably in my top 5 favorite songs ever. And so it's like,
masterpiece.
I do that with a lot of things, like Dylan and everything. Like, you start getting live things just because like you want to hear the song for the first time again. And so because of that, I think like I really do enjoy these live performances. Like if I was just, alive when Velvet Underground was, coming up and I was cool and I had White Light, White Heat, and then I saw him live at the Matrix thing, like maybe I'd be a little disappointed that I didn't get this like noise freak out thing. But I think it's cool that they can do both. It's not just like a band.
Well, yeah, I mean, like think of it, because we all love, right? Like the self-titled album. And so, I mean, like this is what I'm saying. It's part of the appeal of the Grateful Dead, and it's interesting how I wish the Velvet Underground was around longer so we could see how they evolved, because that's like almost the most fun thing about the Grateful Dead. These songs you love, they like evolve over the years. And so don't you think it's kind of cool, Darren, to hear like Sister Ray reinterpreted for the self-titled era? And wouldn't it be awesome to hear it go on for years longer?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, we've kind of talked about that before when we were talking about live performances and not wanting to just hear the studio take live.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And I don't think that Sister Ray's studio take could ever really be done live like that over and over. It would be too difficult to. It would never be good enough, I think, is what the key is. So changing it up entirely, I'm all for that. I all I'm saying is that it's hard to beat the studio version if we were doing like a head-to-head comparison. But I totally enjoyed both of these, live versions. Well, all three of them, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess in the Grateful Dead world, people kind of they get their favorites at some point, but it's like not about what's the best one. It's just like fascinating to hear more. And like I wish so much that the Velvet Underground had been documented as much as the Grateful Dead, because I would love to hear this piece evolve. And again, sort of like returning to the main topic, I'm like kind of fascinated that a band like the Velvet Underground, which is in theory so opposed to what the Grateful Dead represents, as they say, would be interested in that same kind of like exploring a jam for 40 minutes, letting the piece evolve over the years, like seeing what new places you can go with it. I mean, in sort of returning to these similarities and differences, it was an interesting experience to listen to these two tracks side by side. I was personally struck with, not only how similar like their kind of origins, where these songs come from and like what they're kind of chasing with these songs. But also it's interesting how it's like by that 1972 Dark Star, it's kind of mellowing out. It doesn't get as spacey and weird. It's more of like a jazzy kind of, thing with the drums going the whole time and everything. And it's also interesting that Sister Ray is mellowing out as the months in this case go on. Did anything strike you listening is back to back? Isn't it kind of interesting, these parallels?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I'm sure not a lot of people have listened to Dark Star and Sister Ray back to back to back to back, like we did, especially so many times. But yeah, it was like, I think the first time I went through the little playlist, you hear Dark Star, and then Sister Ray comes on, and you're at first just like taken by the differences. You went from this like shimmery, nice, for the most part, like sounding happy-ish song to like being kicked in the face by like a distorted guitar and a guy screaming about drugs and everything. But then when you go through it again and everything, you like and especially with the Matrix tape and everything, you like see that they're sort of doing the same like thing in principle, just like kind of going about it differently.
Very different.
Like you talked about, like reading, you can read a book, the same book two different ways and whatnot. They like really, I think listening to them back to back like really showcases that they sort of are two sides of the same coin almost.
Yeah, what were your takeaways listening back to back like this, Darren?
Yeah, I think as you go on down the playlist, the similarities start to come out a lot more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, especially as it mellows out. As Ray mellows out. The chords they don't even do chords anymore. It's just like
exactly
these slippery.
I was thinking about that too, and I'm like, man, are they even playing the same? They're just not playing the same notes anymore. You know what I mean? It's like it's so different. But like the Matrix, Sister Ray sounds a lot like the start of Dark Star. You know what I mean?
It kind of does.
Like quiet, noodling of a guitar. And then again, Lou Reed reminds you that this is Sister Ray by jumping in with his lyrics. And I think that's what really, keeps these two from being almost identical or very, too similar, right? I think it's that's still that same mindset of, the East Coast, Velvet Underground
subject matter.
Yes, like still, looking directly into life and not trying to escape it or anything like that, not trying to sail into a black hole, but rather, like you mentioned, like burning the world down because something like that exists. You know what I mean? Because it just sort of means that there's no meaning behind anything, right? And the lyrics, like, I think maintain that, even though he sings them in a much more like mellow sounding way and not as frantic as the studio version.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about it now, it's actually very interesting that everybody came around to the Velvet Underground's point of view. You know, like that's the whole idea, is that the 60s were very idealist, and then like the crushing reality of the 70s sort of hits everybody. You know, you hear everybody like John Lennon turns into a cynic, you know, and stuff like that. But somehow the Grateful Dead remain like pure idealists all the way into the mid 90s, you know, kind of incredible. But, you know, the big question, I don't expect to have converted you or anything, but did you come to like Dark Star a little bit? Did you get even mildly interested in checking out more Grateful Dead, either of you?
I mean, I think my level of Grateful Dead fandom has basically been the same for 15-ish years, and it'll probably stay that, you know. I get into points where like I find myself, you know, like sometimes you just can't like figure out what the fuck you want to listen to. A lot of times when I get in those moods, I'll just put on a show from, you know, like a 70s or 60s Dead show, because you know, it'll last 3 hours, so I don't have to pick anything else for the rest of the night. You know, it's good. You know, so I like the Grateful Dead. Like, I don't want anyone listening to this to think that I don't like the Grateful Dead. I do. I just don't like them as much as the people listening do.
Okay. It does kind of appeal, I wanted to say, Dan, to like, you know, we have this kind of like completist thing about our music fandom, which is like,
I think that's
scouring the internet for this and this. Like, it really appeals to me, but it's like an impossible.
I think that's
what
exactly. I think that's one thing that sort of bothers me about the Dead, because any band I like, I have listened to every record of theirs, even if like they start getting real bad. You know, I'll power through it. Although I've never listened to Squeeze from Velvet Underground ever.
Me neither,
Yule's Dead Body, I'll listen to that. But otherwise, but yeah, the Dead. There's like literally no way you could ever like listen to every single just officially released shows. You could never do it. Like it's an insurmountable task, and I think that does like sort of scare me away a little bit.
Well, how about you, Darren? Did you find anything you like about Dark Star? Did you get intrigued?
I mean, I liked Dark Star by the end of all of this. But like you were just mentioning, like I still feel like it's too daunting of a task to try to tackle the Grateful Dead. Like, I feel like I would need someone to like curate a playlist or a list of like, here's what you should hear or need to hear.
Hey, funny you say that. I'll do that for you.
I just don't know where to go. I don't know where to go. And like you know, Dan, you're talking about a lot of live albums, but then I guess there's studio albums. So like, I don't know. It's just I wouldn't say that like Dark Star was enough to make me like very, very interested, but it's certainly like I didn't hate it. I didn't hate it at all. I appreciated it. I thought it was cool. It was kind of what I sort of thought it would be, you know. And if there's, you know, more of that, or if there's more to explore, I would be interested. Yeah, if you curated something, I would certainly check it out.
Oh, I'll totally do it. Actually, seriously, watch that Long Strange Trip documentary, and you'll be like, really
is great.
And it does give you a sense of like their different stages, and you would kind of be like, "Oh, that stage sounds really appealing to me." And they do play a lot of music. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so you know, as we kind of like get toward the end here, I wanted to sort of return to this idea of, you know, the Grateful Dead sort of lasting too long, you know, and trying to figure out like, why does or did the Grateful Dead leave a bad taste in our mouths, you know, while the Velvet Underground certainly doesn't. Did you guys, I provided a couple bonus tracks to our little assignment listening here. One was a 1967 performance of Sister Ray, which would have been so close to the time that they recorded the studio one that I thought, let's just do the studio. The other one was a 1990 Dark Star. I don't imagine, did either of you guys get a chance to skim through this?
I did. I listened to that 90 Dark Star, and that was not very good. that like when the saxophone, it got cheap. You know, it sound
the MIDI sounds,
God,
like
it got like real 90s aging rock band legacy act sounding. I did not enjoy that whatsoever.
What about you, Darren?
Yeah, I checked it out, but was definitely not at all feeling it. And then the Sister Ray is so much like the studio version, but it becomes sort of clear that, I mean, that was just an amazing take, that studio version. You know what I mean? That maybe like lightning in a bottle, like it just could not live up to that.
Yeah. When it comes to the 1991, again, I should just clarify, it's just, I'm sure there's stuff to be discovered. I just haven't made it that far yet, but it's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to one day be able to like ignore the bad MIDI keyboards and stuff, or if I'm supposed to like learn to like that sound, but it just sounds,
I think it's just
very,
it's one of those sounds that gets dated, like the 80s had a lot of that kind of stuff. It's just like a technology that got outdated. Like the guitar has been around since, the electric guitar has been around since the 50s, and it's still, around and whatever. But, like a lot of early synths, and especially like computerized synths, it was a totally different type of technology. And it's just, now we can do so much better that they sound old and cheesy. Like you hear that sound and it's from the late 80s or early 90s. It's just one of those things that you can like immediately place where you are, whereas like the guitar, drums, don't do that.
And there's something like very real and like it just feels like very something you can like reach out and touch and feel, or something about the Grateful Dead's music. I can't get over the fact, like, you can watch the 1972 performance in Veneta like on YouTube and stuff. They released like a film of this concert, and actually you maybe you remember from the documentary, the clip, Dan, where there's like a naked guy that looks like Iggy Pop just like dancing behind Jerry. It's fucking bizarre. This guy is like completely naked and sunburned and just dancing like a maniac. But anyway, you just can't get over like when you hear it and then you look at it and it's like just, like five guys like standing there. They've made like such a huge sound, and it's really just five guys. And then by the time you get, there's no, you associate like prog and, this kind of stuff with like big light shows and all of that shit, and the Grateful Dead is just not that at all. But then I think by the time you get to like the 90s, it is kind of that, there's something kind of sad about it. I think that's why I like the documentary so much. It kind of details this like sort of sad end that happens where the scene becomes less about music and more about just like a bunch of frat bros like getting shit-faced all weekend, at the Grateful Dead show, like they're tailgating. There's the MIDI effects and stuff, which are, on one hand, like dated and bad, but also, it's kind of like that laziness of like how to make something experimental. You know what I mean? Like just add some sound effects to it, where I'm amazed at these early performances where it's like, and actually a lot of 60s psychedelic music where it's like just, the only effect they have is like some distortion because the amp can distort a little, and the fact that they make psychedelic sounds without all the fucking delay pedals and chorus and reverb and phasers and shit that we have today, is fascinating. And by the time you get to the 90s, they're kind of relying on that. There's also something really sad about, like in the documentary, in the early one of the, maybe the first one, he kind of says, like we're playing live so much. And when you play live a lot, this is Jerry talking. He says like, you learn the tricks, it becomes a trick where like, how to get the audience to get up and dance. How to get them to ask for an encore, how to get a standing ovation. Like once you master those little things, they become like routines. And he sort of says he's got these ambitions at the beginning, which, to be fair, they do a great job for like 20 years of actually chasing these ambitions and being genuinely boundary pushing. But he's like, once you get that, you got to leave it, and find something else, because otherwise it just becomes like a craft, And by the 90s, that's what it is, It's like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, and it makes complete sense. And I mean, like you said, it is impressive that they managed to do that for 20 years or so, because by the 90s, You almost don't blame anybody that's like still going from the 60s and into the 90s. You can't really blame them for being a legacy act. I mean, I would do it too for the money they were probably making,
right.
And they're older. I'm sure, like in the documentary, they talk about like Jerry had gotten real into like scuba diving or snorkeling or something, and like he didn't want to be thinking up a new way to make Dark Star. I'm sure like he doesn't give as much of a shit about it anymore, which is fine. You shouldn't at that age. And then bands we've talked about this time and time again. Bands, when they do get a little money, now they can afford to pay the saxophone guy on stage, and you end up like getting
have the light show and
exactly,
all that.
and it's like it kind of like eats away at itself, like just its own success. It's hard to hold up like under that weight. But I don't blame it. If this version was from 1972, I would say, Jesus Christ. But it being 90, I feel like if you were seeing the Dead in 1990, you probably were seeing them for a nostalgia act, or because you weren't old enough to see them in the 60s or anything,
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of similar. This is kind of a long, or like a stretch a bit, but like it's similar to like the Weezer problem. You know what I mean? Like you have like the Blue Album and Pinkerton, and like now Rivers is like 40 something, and yet fans are still like longing for a return to that. But like Weezer has gone in a different direction. They've grown up and whatever, and like I would be shocked if we were listening to this 90 version of the Grateful Dead and it still sounded like they were searching and exploring the way they did back in the 60s and 70s.
I mean, nobody can keep an edge for 35, 40 years. It just...
Otherwise, they're faking it, right? I mean,
exactly. I mean, nobody has like stayed on the cutting edge for that long. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very interesting because to return to that festival that I went to, it's kind of crazy because it kind of does recreate that vibe of like the 80s, 90s, what it must have been like, right? Even though they're playing shows sometimes from the 70s and 60s and stuff, but I think about this thing called Drums Space. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but going back to like the very beginning, they would do these like things where it becomes, because they had two drummers for most of their existence, and actually not in the 1972 Dark Star that we listened to, but they would do this thing where it's just a drum solo. Like these two are just sort of experimenting, and then it's like the band would take a short break while the two drummers just go nuts on like all kinds of gongs and shit.
And what was that big thing they had built? Like it's got a name.
The wall of
no, not that. The it's like an instrument that one of the drummers uses. What the fuck is that thing called? It's like this long wooden thing. I think it has some strings on it. So somebody will email us.
Yeah. So yeah, some kind of crazy thing. Yes, and as you see, like as the years go on, it just gets, their drum sets get bigger and bigger with more like MIDI effects and stuff, and more like huge gongs and more like crazy bongos and crazy shit, right? So throughout their whole career, they do this little ritual where it's like they take a break and the drummers get to like go nuts. They come back and they just go into like pure noise, like drone kind of vibes for a little bit. Early in their career, it would be called, instead of space, they would just call it feedback. They would straight up go from drums to just a wall of feedback for a while before like slowly turning that into something, And so it starts off as this genuinely experimental thing. And by the 90s, by the thing that I'm seeing, in the Dark Star Jubilee, it's like just a routine. Like everybody knows how drums goes. They know this is when you walk back to your campsite and take a leak and get some more beer, and then by the time you get back, it'll be over. But also, there's just nothing adventurous about it. It's like everything that Jerry says he didn't want to do at the start of this documentary. And I know that by the end of the Grateful Dead's career, that's what they are, And so basically, tie it back to Sister Ray, I believe that there's a lot of baggage from what the Grateful Dead kind of becomes that makes us see them as not an equally adventurous and equally experimental and important cult band as the Velvet Underground. I wonder if you guys agree with that. And also, as a little like, let's say like a genie appeared and he was like, okay, you'll get live recordings of like the Velvet Underground will never break up, and you'll get live recordings of Sister Ray for like decades. But by the end, the Velvet Underground will become a very sad, terrible nostalgia band. Would you take that deal?
Will Lou Reed still make an album with Metallica at the
Yeah, let's say yes.
Okay, well, because if we got rid of that, then I'd take it. But no, I don't think I would take it, because I think you're right. The Velvet Underground, they were never famous like when they existed, basically.
Right.
And so, everyone like discovers this thing that's already got a beginning and got an end to it. And the Velvet Underground did reunite in, is it 93? There's that one live album.
Yeah,
I think it's 93.
like that.
But it was a very short-lived, him and Cale, Lou and Cale couldn't keep it together.
Right.
They never played Sister Ray either, I checked. But yeah, like the Dead has that baggage. And I think the problem with the Dead, too, is the Dead weren't as famous in the 60s and 70s. They became famous, like, in this sort of late thing. So, like, a lot of people who are, had never really listened to it or, haven't discovered it, like, that's what you see first. They had that, like, famous music video on MTV where they would, like, turn into skeletons and shit. And, like, they're
Touch of Grey.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And like they're pretty old, like when that's going on, and then there's that Grateful Dead movie, and I remember just like it's like weird. Like as a little kid, like I knew what the Grateful Dead were. My parents don't listen to them or anything, but like they just were like on TV and like a part of like culture. Whereas like the Velvet Underground, like become that, but it's not like a 10-year-old kid or whatever. Meaning when Jerry died, I was like 6. Like a 6-year-old didn't know. I didn't know who Lou Reed was, but I probably knew who Jerry Garcia was. At least I had seen him before. And so like when you have this like what could have become, or just having a beginning and end, that's all your peak. It makes it much easier to be cool, like, because I think the Grateful Dead, if the Grateful Dead stops in the 70s, I think they're looked back as pretty cool,
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
In fact, their fan base too, I think gets a lot of shit. Like if you take away the fan base of the Grateful Dead,
there's a little bit of that like overexposure thing, with like I get like a Bob Marley vibe where it's like the whoever's in charge of the marketing is willing to sell their brand to literally fucking anything.
Oh yeah,
so you can buy anything with a Grateful Dead logo.
You can
on
literally
it,
go to I bought my dog a Grateful Dead bandana at Target on clearance.
And actually, in some way, like a simplification happens because I think about like Bob Marley, right? Our idea of him is like this kind of peace and love thing, and then like you finally listen to his records for the first time, and you're like, this is way more fucking hardcore than what this like popular brand image of Bob Marley on t-shirts is not what he really is. I think there's a lot of depth to the Grateful Dead, particularly in this like genuine experimentalism and stuff that's like, and maybe their lyrics are a little, utopian and stuff like that. But I think there's also a lot of like darkness in them sometimes. And so, that's overexposure simplification is harmful. Do you agree with this, Darren, that maybe the Grateful Dead do deserve a lot more respect amongst the kind of people who like Velvet Underground people, as we would say. But there's something about the branding and the going on too long that's maybe the main culprit here.
Well, certainly, because if they don't go on into the 80s and 90s, then whenever we discover them, we're going to discover them, in the era of the 60s and the 70s, and that'll be it. There will be no there will be no preconceived notion or whatever like I've been describing, like, oh, Jerry Garcia, he's just like this old guy, and then he's got like a Ben and Jerry's ice cream flavor, right? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, none of that would exist. And the question about the genie thing that you mentioned, like, I'd say absolutely not. As much as I would love more live recordings of the Velvet Underground, I would not want to see a career that goes in that direction, in watching them on like these infomercials where they're talking about these career box sets of the Velvet Underground, you know what I mean, and like old Lou Reed and all this stuff. Like, oh god, no.
And you know, genies are always like trying to trick you. So you take it, you get 30 years. It's the Doug Yule version. 30 years of Doug Yule.
30 years of Squeeze. Just reinterpreting every Squeeze song
for 30 years. And Lou Reed rejoins, but he's like a sideman now. It's awful.
Yeah, that's like that Reddit, the monkey paw thing, where you make a wish and they think of the worst way it could possibly go.
Exactly. All right, well, is that enough for this week then?
Yeah, I think we're out of time here.
All right, well, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe we'll read it on the air. You can email us, popshieldpod@gmail.com. Next episode's going to be in 2 weeks. This is one I'm excited about, Bob Dylan and the Rolling Thunder Review. So if you like the show, help us out by subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that is at PopShieldPod. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.